Greetings, I'm Dike Rostant. Welcome to In Depth. November is many things to many people. One of the things that the month helps to do is to focus on men's health. And when we say health, we're talking all the range of possibilities. We are going to have a conversation with someone who's a psychologist, an educator, a researcher, and so much more, Dr. Margaret Nakhid-Chatoor, about unmasking the silence for men as it pertains to their mental health. Hello, Dr. Nakhid-Chatoor. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you for bringing these things to the fore on a very consistent basis. Because sometimes somebody will say something and then they stop, but this is something that you do. So, in terms of an introduction to men's health, how important is men's health specifically to men?
Good afternoon, Dike, or hi, Dike. Thanks for having me on. As you know, I think mental health overall is very important to everyone. But I want to start off by saying specifically that globally, one man dies by suicide every single minute. So that every 60 seconds, somewhere in this world, we lose a father, a brother, a colleague, a son, they are gone. In Trinidad and Tobago and across the Caribbean, the rates are especially alarming, because behind each number is a man who thought that he did not have a space to talk about how he feels. He could not unmask his pain. So that we are witnessing, I think, more than ever, the devastating reality of untreated mental health struggles for men. And we see this in the domestic violence this week that escalates into a murder-suicide. We see it in families torn apart, in communities that grieve for this loss. As you said, November reminds us that men's mental health is not a private matter. It has never been. It is a public health issue. It has to be considered thus because it affects every home, every workplace, and every relationship.
But when you say it is not a private matter, but then we juxtapose that by men feeling an inability to unmask their pain. How do you put those two things together?
So, as we know, long ago or throughout cultures, and this is not just our own society, but globally, men are culturally affected by the fact that their mental well-being is possibly not something to consider. All right, I think that talking about mental health is vital, especially for men, because men have to come to realize that their physical well-being is equally as important as their mental well-being. And they have to begin to look at them to promote this overall well-being. I think that for too long, men have been taught, don't cry, be strong, be very stoic. And in doing that, they fear to be weak, they fear to cry, they fear to be vulnerable, especially when it comes to relationships. Just yesterday, I was having a conversation with about 7 men, and I was asking them about their take on mental health, and they're saying that many times they shut down because they are not validated by the women in their lives, their mothers and their partners, etc. And that one instance of rejection can shut them down without ever speaking. So when we talk about mental health, we have to recognize, one, the overall well-being that it serves, improving their quality of life, their relationships, their daily functioning. And I think even in this conversation that we are having, it reduces the stigma because we are highlighting some of the mental challenges that they would have. It helps to break down the social stereotypes that men should not be affected by emotional struggles, and they are. Many men are affected by emotional struggles, but breaking it down, talking about it, encourages them to seek help without being ashamed. And for me, a healthy man contributes to a healthy family. A healthy family means that you're having a healthy nation. And a healthy nation means that you're looking at the overall well-being societal value. As we're saying in this month also, we want to prevent suicides. We want to prevent crises because men, more than women, are statistically more likely to die by suicide. So recognizing, supporting their mental health can prevent strategies and save lives.
And I think it's a previous conversation where the statistics may have pointed to the fact that it's not necessarily that there are more men attempting suicide or dealing with that practical ideation or active ideation as opposed to passive, but the methodologies used a lot more successful. But I also want you to speak to that fear of shame, that fear of being vulnerable and then being shut down that the gentleman would have shared with you, and how that inability to express the thoughts that lead to the emotions and articulate them, and that link between mental health and domestic violence. Thank you.
Right. So I like to call it the silence behind the violence. And for many men, they are socialized to suppress their emotions, which really equates to vulnerability and being very weak. So this also November coincides with the month that addresses gender-based violence, and this is directed against someone because of their gender or sex. As we see here, the unequal power relations that continue to be to have in the society. So when sadness and fear and insecurity, and we're talking about men here who were socialized to suppress their emotions, to not be vulnerable, to not be weak. So when you have men being sad, men being fearful, men being insecure, especially as regards their relationships, and that is not being allowed to be expressed, then you have it resurfacing as anger, as aggression, and as a loss of self-control. Because we are, in many societies, we sort of look upon men being aggressive as more acceptable than men crying. We look at men being violent possibly as more acceptable than men saying, I'm sorry, or the things that are associated with women. And as you said here, less men may attempt suicide, but more of them are accomplished in it, meaning that they seek to end their lives by violent means. And that is why more of them tend to be successful than women. Women have outlets. When something happens, they seek validation in their friends, in their families, in their social support systems that they have built up. Men don't. So we have the patriarchal norms decay in our society that continue to reinforce the idea that men must dominate, they must provide, they must control. So as I said, when they are dysregulated, when they see relationships falling apart, when they are not in control, the anger steps in. And the victim, they become not the victor anymore, but the victim. And they are not allowed to express their feelings. And if I could just go to that recent incident of domestic violence, you know, I heard the lady's father saying, you know, many times I told her to come out of that relationship. And he said, even a few days before, the fella called out to me, he said, come by me now. Come, I need to talk to you. And the father never really went. And I'm saying that sometimes it is difficult for men to reach out, to talk to a brother, to talk to a person. But when you hear that call for help, go. And as I told that group I had yesterday, the 7 men, I said, you need to watch out for each other, for other men. It is not about women sending these messages, but I think the messages are stronger, really stronger when they come from other men who see their struggle, other men who can say, what's going on, bro? Tell me now, tell me what's happening now. You know, and I think the message there, Dike, is stronger.
And that is a point we're going to use to take a short break. We are speaking with Dr. Margaret Nakhid-Chatoor. Stay with us. We'll return after this. Welcome back. We are speaking about men's mental health. Specifically, we're doing so with Dr. Margaret Nakhid-Chatoor. Very happy to have her on. There's a point that you made when somebody reaches out to you, go. Because there's so many barriers that we have learned growing up as men that society has placed on us as individuals, that when you are willing to put to give an send a flare up, as it were, saying that I need this, it's important that people recognize that and honor that cry for help. But with that in mind, I want to ask you, Dr. Nakhid-Chatoor, in terms of giving us some indicators that we should be looking for, signs, warning indicators, triggers. What are some of those things that we should be a little more aware of?
Right, and you touch on two important points there, Dike. One, the sort of indicators that we should look out to. And secondly, when a man is asking for help, see it as a sign to go in. And I want to address those two. So some of the indicators of men's distress can be looking at their changes in mood and behaviors. And so they become a little bit more irritable than otherwise, angry, aggressive, possibly men's withdrawal from family or friends. They're no longer part of the life, no part of the conversation. A persistent heaviness, a sadness, a hopelessness that surrounds them. You see them possibly neglecting their hygiene, neglecting their family duties, not wanting to talk to the wife or the children or mother, not WhatsApping, and especially sudden mood swings. Some of the physical symptoms that you may see are men possibly having sleep disturbances, not sleeping as usually, changes in appetite or weight, eating more, eating less, a sort of low energy, an apathy, a listlessness about them. And again, the risky behavior that when these things start to happen, they engage in. So more drinking of alcohol, more abuse of substances. And I want to say here that many times when these incidents occur, domestic violence, suicide, it is because the mind is impaired, because some kind of substance or drink or something has happened that impairs their rationality, that makes them more prone to risky behaviors. For example, reckless driving. So you have to look at the consumption of these things. And lastly, difficulty concentrating, difficulty making decisions. At work, there's a decreased productivity. Employers need to recognize this and not just feel that the employee is being tardy. That in decreasing productivity, that forgetfulness, that trouble focusing. I remember when I was part of an EAP program and you had men coming in to talk to me. I remember one man in particular, lots of relationship problems he was having, and he hadn't eaten for days. He came into the office with his little lunch kit, and after the conversation, which must have lasted about 2 hours, he said, I'm well hungry now, I'm feeling to eat. And I allowed him to go into the office kitchen, and this man just sat down and ate because it was as if a weight was lifted off. He had the forum, not judging. I wasn't judging him. There was no family member to condemn him, but he was allowed to express how he felt. And that weight off his shoulders just made him hungry and made him be who he was again. So I marvel at that. The second point that you addressed was when somebody reaches out and latching back on this thing about giving you the forum to talk. I believe that we have to normalize conversations. We have to make mental health, men's mental health, part of the ordinary conversations, not just in the lime, as I said in my article, not just in the banter, but especially in places where men may frequent. And one of the things I mentioned was faith spaces, the mosque, the temple, the church. And I want to mention it here because many times in these spaces, these community leaders, and so they talk about so many things, but they do not see men's struggles as something to talk about. Many times, it goes unspoken. When sermons really could emphasize resilience, it could emphasize faith, but they really acknowledge depression or grief or suicidal thoughts as part of the human condition. All of this is part of the human condition, but they focus on so many other things, and too many times suffering is seen as weakness, deepening men's shame, deepening their silence. But I want that faith spaces, and I mentioned this because this is where we can speak from a frame of reference. They solidarity for men. When leaders, these community leaders in our spaces speak about men's mental health, they signal that their struggles are not taboo, but part of the human experience. So again, we have to normalize conversations about men's mental health and about mental health in general.
And I don't know how to respond to that, Dr. Chatoor. Because
Tell me
to
what you're
start off with,
thinking.
I think sometimes in those faith spaces, there's a level of guilt and shame because God gave us life so that we can enjoy all things, as opposed to saying, okay, well, we're asking for all things to enjoy life. And then sometimes I could see somebody saying, but you're not praying hard enough, or you're ungrateful, this kind of way. So you get up this morning, and then that list of indicators that you would have itemized. Well, I think I need to go and check somebody. So in terms of normalizing and encouraging men to seek that sort of help, what is the first step? Because as you say, sometimes people can find areas and spaces where they feel a little more welcome, but it may not be the healthiest.
Yeah. I think your family, I always talk about connections. Connections, Dike, save lives. Many persons, and in the last few weeks since I've had a lot of young men coming in with a wave of hopelessness and despair. And of course, there are lots of triggers for this, unemployment issues, relationships, and so. But I think families have to get back into making those connections. And I say this broadly because let me tell you, we talk about violence and violence in the society and violence in schools and all of those things. All persons want to be validated. All persons want to be recognized. And I think we are breaking the connections that we formerly had. So you said, where does it begin? Silence often begins at home. So this is where it has to be broken. A boy learns early in his home that crying is weakness. He learns that vulnerability is shame, so that by the time he becomes a man, that mask is firmly in place. Families have to break this cycle. Families have to model openness. Fathers, as I told those gentlemen yesterday, fathers, men have to model openness and teach others that strength includes honesty with each other, honesty about feelings. I can tell you that the first time I saw my father cry was when my mother died. I'd never seen him cry before, and I wondered about that. When children see their fathers cry, they learn that emotions are not weakness, but part of humanity, and they model it to their sons who need to see that, who need to see the show of humanity. Because all of these things that men are struggling with are, as I said, part of the human condition. It is not apart from it, it is a part of it.
And if family is not where it's at, in the sense that the family itself may be upholding and inculcating some of the negative stereotypes, where else does someone turn to?
Right, and that's a very important question because many of these persons always say that they didn't have anyone to turn to, So that is why I said connections are important, connections even with strangers. And let me tell you why this is important. And strangers here, I'm talking about social workers. They're not just anybody out there. Social workers and people who can come into your space. Yesterday I was at this I had gone to this place and I saw this woman and I found she was quite beautiful, and I told her, I said, how come you're not smiling? She said, I haven't smiled in a while, for over a year. And I said, what's happening? And I was a stranger, and she says, tomorrow is the anniversary of my son's death. He died a year ago and I have not smiled. And just like that, Dike, I started a conversation with this woman, this mother who had lost her only child. And at the end of it, she said, God sent you. And I said, no, I said, he sent you to me. Because, you know, it is in the connection. I believe you don't have to know the person to say a kind word. You don't have to know the person to validate who they are and how they are. We need those connections, because you are saying in families, sometimes it doesn't happen. Families sometimes are the worst spaces for persons to be. But workplaces are another place for connections to happen, faith spaces, community places, you know, but unfortunately, we do not have those safe spaces. And this is something I've always lobbied for. In Trinidad and Tobago, we don't have to wait for other countries to do it. We need safe spaces where men, where women, where they can come together to tell their story. We need those, an invitation open, come. Long ago, we had those community centers. I remember as a young, in my 20s, working in places like Wampanoags. I wonder if you know where that is. You know,
So cool, yes.
doing a
One
lot
time
of
I had a
voluntary
thing in
work.
Rampanalgas RC, and that was very interesting.
Yeah. I did a lot of volunteer work with strangers, with people, and you know, you give of your time and services, and we need those kinds of spaces for people, open invitations for them to heal. I call them healing spaces. So it's
And
a
we want to thank
difficult question, but I think that we need to start putting some things in place for that. Yes.
and we want to thank you for making the time. And when I said the family may not be where it's at, and this is not necessarily out of malice, as opposed to these are the things that have been
That's
learned,
reality.
and behavior sometimes is caught rather than taught. So is for lack of a better um, precedent that this is why the situation is there on many occasions. I would love to think, but Dr. Margaret Nakhid-Chatoor, thank you so much. We want to thank you for your insight. We want to thank you for your presence and spirit as you would have treated with that young woman, just reaching out to her, because sometimes that still small voice says, "Oh gosh, we'll do this and make this overture," but uh we don't always follow that still small voice. So we want to thank
That's
you for
right.
doing that. And on behalf of the entire crew here at TTT, this has been In Depth with me, Dike. Thank you so much for joining us.